In today's video, we will cover everything you need to know about SQlite database in Flutter. We will explore SQlite by building a to-do app and perform all basic CRUD operations for creating, reading, updating, and deleting tasks. SQlite is a lightweight SQL database that is used for storing structured data. For the sake of this tutorial, we will use sqflite package, that is a wrapper for SQlite in Flutter. So, to start with this tutorial, we need to get the start code. I have put everything inside the GitHub repository. The link is in the description. Make sure that you choose the starter branch and come to the code and download the zip file. Once you're done downloading the zip file, open everything inside the VS Code. So let's start by creating our task model. Right now we're inside main.dart. So let's open up our model folder, and inside that we have task.dart. Here we first of all need to define our task table, and this is the name of our task table. Tasks. We also need to define our task fields, and these are going to be our task columns inside the database. So let's start by defining our ID. We have a title, description, started, and also is completed. And we also need to create a list of these fields. This is going to be used when retrieving our task from database. So let's now create our actual task model, and for that we need to import foundation.dart. So let's define our ID, and this is going to be nullable. We also have title, description, started, and also is completed. So let's create a constructor here, and as you see that the only property that is not required is our ID. Now we need to create our copy method, and what this method does is that it returns a copy of our task with certain properties. So we need to get all the properties here, including ID, and these are all going to be nullable. So let's get all the properties. And now we need to return our task model. So inside the task model, I'm going to say if the ID is not null, return the ID, otherwise return the this ID. And this ID refers to the actual ID inside our class. So it means there is no change. We also need to do the same for other properties. Next, we need to create our toMap and fromMap methods. And inside the toMap method, we're going to return a map. And inside this map, I'm going to return my properties in form of a map. So let's do the same for all our other properties. And lastly, we need to define our fromMap method. In this method, we get a map and return a task out of it. So if the ID is not null, you have to return the task fields.id. Otherwise, you have to return null because ID is nullable. I'm going to do the same for all the other properties except that they cannot be null. So I'm not going to pass any checks here. So this is pretty much everything about our model. Let's save here, and next we need to define our database. So for the sake of this project, I'm going to be using SQlite. And if you want to be able to use SQlite, you need to add sqflite package inside your dependencies. We also need the Intel package for formatting our dates, and also this path package for getting the application path. So let's go define our database, and I'm going to define it inside the database folder and task database.dart. So let's start by creating our task database, and I'm going to define it as an immutable. For that, we also need to import our foundation.dart and show immutable. So inside the task database, we need to define a database name and also a database version. We also need to create a singleton out of our class because we only want to be a single instance of our class available to the entire project. For that, we create a private constructor, and then we create a public instance to return it. We also need an instance of our database. And for that, we need to import sqflite package because this database comes from sqflite package. We also need to create a getter for our database. So if the database is not null, return the database, and otherwise, if it is null, we need to call any database method and then return it. So let's create any database method. Here we first get our database path, and we use get database path that comes from SQlite. Then we need to join our database path to the database name that we define above. For that, we also need to import the path method to have the join method here. Now let's call the open database method. This method takes a path, a version, and also a non-create. So we need to create this method here, and this method takes a DB and also a version. Inside this method, we need to define our database types. So the first type is going to be ID type. Our ID is going to be integer, and this is also called primary key because This is the key through which we update or delete our task, and this is also auto increment because this is getting incremented every time we add a new task. We also have a text type and also Boolean type, and by default SQlite does not support booleans, so we need to store 0 or 1 inside it. So using our DB, we need to call execute method. This method creates a table using create table command, and also the name is going to be task table. So let's import task.dart because that is where the task table came from. And remember, the task table is just name of our table. So here we need to define all our columns for the table. We first have an ID type, title type, description type, start date, and also is completed. Now we need to start defining our methods. The first method that we define is a create task. This method takes a task from here, and inside it we get an instance of our database, and then we call insert method. This method requires 4 properties. Inside the insert method we pass our task table name, then we pass the task.toMap because insert method cannot take a complete task by itself, so we need to convert the task to a map before. And then we get the ID of the task created here and return it inside the new task. And remember that this is creating a copy of our task and passing the ID. So the next method that we define is readTask. This method returns the task by its ID. So first of all, let's get our instance of the database. Then we need to query our database and pass the table name. Then we need to provide our columns because these are the 5 columns that we have. I'm going to say you have to return all the columns. Then we specify a condition using where clause, and I'm going to say pass the task to me that whose ID is equal to this ID. So this is the syntax for saying which ID we need. And then if the task data is not empty, you have to convert it from map to a task and then return it. Otherwise, we just need to throw an exception. So the next method that we return is getting all the tasks, and this is returning a list of tasks. So here again we need an instance of our database, and we use that instance to query. We need to pass the task table name, and we also need to order by. So this is an optional property, but I'm going to pass it and say by default I want the task to be sorted ascendingly and according to start date. Then I'm going to save the result inside the result parameter, and then I'm going to map each and every of my result. Each of them is going to be a task map, so I'm going to convert each of them to a task and then turn them into a list. So the next method that we return is update a task. So this method takes a new task that we need to update. Again, here we take our instance and call the update method. Inside the update method, we pass our table name and also the task, the toMap. Again, we need to pass our where clause to make sure which task we update. So then we also have another update task, and that's going to be called mark task as completed. This method requires an ID and also is completed. So inside this method, again, I'm going to be using update, pass the table name, and then inside the isCompleted property, see that this time we are not passing entire task. I'm just going to say go inside isCompleted, and if isCompleted is true, pass a 1, otherwise 0. Then we need to specify our where clause to say which task we need to update. And the next method that we define is a delete task. This method takes an ID and according to that deletes this. So again, we need to pass the task table name and also pass the where clause. And lastly, we need to pass the close method. This method closes our database, and we need to close our database when we dispose the page. So these were all the methods that we needed here. Let's save it and close everything. So now that we're done defining our database, it is time for us to work on the UI. Right now, if we go inside main.dart, you see that we only return a scaffold here, but I want to return my home screen. So let's just define our home screen, and for that I'm going to go inside library. First of all, create a folder called screens, and inside that I'm going to create home screen. So home screen is going to be an stateful widget, and let's call it home screen. And let's also make sure to import material.dart only. So here I'm going to return a scaffold. And inside the scaffold, first of all, we have an app bar. And inside the app bar, we're going to have a title. And let's say tasks, list, You can say whatever you are. But the important part for me is the floating action button. So let's define it. Inside the floating action property, we have an onPress, and we also have a child. Inside the child, I'm going to put an icon, and let's say icons.add. Now let's go inside main.dart and import our home screen. Done. So now we need to run our application, but before that I'm gonna bring my emulator to the side so you can have a glimpse of the UI that we want to design here. This is the UI for a task screen. So first of all, let's run our application. So our app is up and running right now, and as you see here, we have a scaffold with task list and also our floating action button. So inside this floating action button, every time we click, we have to go to the add task screen that I showed you as UI. So first of all, let's create that screen, and I'm going to go inside screens folder and create a screen called add task screen.dart. I'm going to also define it as an stateful widget, and let's call it add task screen. And for some reason, we keep importing foundation.dart where we don't need it. So now inside home screen, every time we click on this, we have to navigate to that screen. So let's say navigator of context.push, and we have to provide a material route. And inside the builder, I'm going to return add task screen. So let's save everything. And now if we click on this, this is going to navigate us to a task screen. So this is a screen that we're going to design first. So here again, I'm going to start by a scaffold. And this scaffold has an app bar, again with the title. And we also have a body, inside which we have a single child scroll view. Inside which we have a padding. And I'm going to define a symmetric padding with a horizontal space of 16 and also vertically 12. We also need to define our child here, and the child is going to be a column. So this column is the place that we want to put all our form inside. So for that, we need to wrap our column with a form. And every form widget requires a form key. So let's define that here. This key is going to be of type global key and form state. So if you want to learn more about creating a form in Flutter and also validating the form, here is a tutorial that I recommend you to watch. But anyway, I'm going to teach how to handle that in this tutorial too. So inside the form, we have a property called key, and we need to provide a form key. So if we hit save now, you see that we have our scaffold and a wide screen. So the first input that we have to define is our text field. So let me take a look at the previous app. You see that we have two text fields. We have a date picker and also we have a button. And let's also not forget that we have a delete button here. So I'm going to define this one first. So to create my delete button, I'm going to first of all go inside actions. And I'm going to put an icon button here. Inside the onPress, I'm going to put nothing for now. But inside the icon, I'm going to put icons.delete. And for the color, I'm going to say colors.red. If we hit save now, we already have our icon, although it doesn't do anything for now. So now we need to start working with our form. But for that, we need some controllers and also properties. So let's define our controllers first. And I'm going to define them as late final, text editing controller. The first one is going to be title controller. Let's also copy. The second is going to be description controller. And we also have a datetime that is called start date. And it's going to be datetime.now. So inside the initSet method, we need to initialize our controllers because right now they're not initialized. Let's also do the same for the description controller. And inside the dispose method, I'm going to dispose of them. So let's do the same with the description controller. Nice. So now that we define our controllers and also start date, so let's go inside the UI. Inside the column, I'm going to put a text form field. First, I'm going to put my controller, and this is going to be title controller. We also need a decoration, and this is going to be of type input decoration. So we need to provide hint text, and I'm going to say title. We also need to provide validator. Validator is a function that is giving us an input. So I'm going to specify a condition here. So if value is not null and value is not empty, or maybe reverse the condition. So if either the value is null or if the value is empty, I'm going to return an error and say, please provide a title. Otherwise, I'm going to return null. So the way it works here is that if you provide a null value, it means that you have no error. But if you return a string, it means that you have an error. And this is going to be considered to be an error message. So let's copy and paste our controller. This time we need to say this is a description controller. And here we also need a description. So we also need the same validator for here. Let's say save. And because we have defined some controllers, we need to hard restart. So now let's again navigate to our screen. You see that we have our title controller and also our description controller. But I guess we need some space, so I'm going to put a size box with a height of 20. Now hit save again, and you see that there is some good space here. So now it is time for us to add our date picker. So let's go, and under the description controller, we first of all need a size box, and under that we need a row. Inside the row we have children, and inside the children we first of all have a text. This text is going to show our start date, and I'm going to format it. And in case you're wondering where this format comes from, this is an extension that we have defined, and I'm going to put it inside the starter code. So if you do not have access to the starter code, you can just copy and paste it here. Next, we also have a text button, and this button is the button that's going to trigger the date picker. So here I'm going to say, or maybe inside this text I'm going to say start date, and put some space here. And inside this button I'm going to put the actual date, and also format it, and make sure this is not constant. So now if we hit save, you see that we already have our start date and also this. But if you click on it, nothing happens. So first of all, I'm going to go inside the row and say the min-max alignment to space between. This way there is some nice space between these two. I also want to make the font bigger. So let's give it some style. Nice. But maybe in a style of 17 is going to be better. So now I also want to make this item clickable. So when you click on it, it should show the date picker. So for that, I'm going to say every time you click on this, you have to call show date picker. So the date picker requires a couple of properties. So we have a context, we have a first date, and I'm going to say date time, and I'm going to say this is going to be year 2000. So you can choose the dates as well at 2000. And the last date is going to be 3000. And we also need to make this function async so that we can listen to our date picker. And we also need to put it inside our start date. So the problem is that this date picker can be null. For example, if you open the date picker and abort it, this will be null. So I'm going to say if the date picker is null, just pick datetime.now. But the problem still persists. Yep, wrong symbol here. So if you now hit save, we have our date picker, and if you click on it, this is going to open up a date picker. So if you, for example, pick a date like yesterday and save the project, this is going to show yesterday, and this is all about the format method. So one problem that I noticed here was that we picked the date but it was not updated. So for that we also need to do a steady state. And now every time we pick a date, like 26, this is also going to steady state and update the UI. So it is all pretty much done. The next thing that we need to define is going to be our button. So let's again put a size box, and I'm going to say this is going to have a height of 20. So the next thing that we're going to put is an elevated button with a text of add task. So wrong place, I guess. So I'm going to bring it inside the column and outside the row. And we also need some spacing here. But I also want to make the button stretch, so let's go to the column. And here I'm going to be using cross-axis alignment and set it to stretch. So if you hit save now, you see that the design is complete. So now that we are done designing our UI, let's also work on the functionality. So here I'm going to create a method for adding a task. I'm going to call this method add task. So let's also make sure this is async. Inside this method we need to create a task. So each task has a couple of properties. For the title I'm going to say title controller.text. For the description we have description controller. For the start date I'm going to say start date, and for the is completed I'm going to say false, because when you add the task for the first time this is going to be false and it is not completed. So here we need to await and call our tasks database. Then we need to reach our instance and call the add task method. I guess we call it create task and pass our task. So every time we click on the add task button, I'm going to go and call this method. So let's come here and inside the onPress, call it add task. So I'm going to start adding a task here. And I'm going to say task 1. Let's also provide a description. And I'm just going to choose a random one. Let's also choose a date here. And I'm going to say 14th. And I'm going to say add task. For now, nothing is going to happen, because if we come back to this screen, we see that we have no tasks. So now that we have mastered how to add a task, let's also display our task. So for that reason, I'm going to come inside my home screen and define two properties. The first property is going to be isLoading. And this is going to be initially set to false. Next, we also need to have a list of tasks. And I'm going to call it tasks. And this is going to be empty for the moment. And let's import it here. Here I also need to define a method for getting all the tasks. So this is going to be a feature of type void get all tasks. Make it async. So when we call this method, first of all we need to set the state and set the isLoading to true. I'm also going to use error syntax, so we don't need these. And every time we are done getting our task, I'm going to set it to false. So between these two state states, I'm going to get a list of tasks. And for that, I'm going to await and use tasks database. Read all tasks. So this is our method. So let's go inside the init state, and under the super.init state, I'm going to call this method. Let's say get all tasks. And let's also make sure that inside this post method, we need to say task database.instance.close. So these were the methods that we needed. Now I'm going to go inside the body. Inside the body, I'm going to be checking if isLoading is true. So if you're inside the isLoading, I'm going to return a center. And inside of it, I'm going to put circular progress indicator. Let's make it constant. And otherwise, if this is not isLoading, this time I'm going to build my task list. So let's now build our task list, and I'm gonna come here, leave one parenthesis behind because we're not gonna get out of the class. So let's build it. Inside this method, I'm gonna return the list view.builder. This list view is gonna return the list of tasks. So first of all, we need the item count, and I'm gonna say tasks.length, and inside the item builder, we have a context and an index. So let's get the first task and say tasks at the index of index. And for each task, you need to return a task list style and pass the task. So let's also define our task list style, and for that we need to create another folder. This file is going to be an stateless widget. And let's also get rid of the extra import. So task list style is going to take a task. So let's say task, and I'm going to make it a required property. So for now, I'm going to just return a Cupertino list style. And the title property is required. So inside the title, I'm going to say task.title. Nice. So let's also make sure that we remove the import for the material.dart because we don't need it anymore. So now let's save the file and go back here. And I'm going to import task list style. So let's save the file and also do a hard restart. The list of tasks should appear here. Let's see if we have an error. As you see here, we have an error about the typecast. So let me just go to the model because most of the typecast errors are inside the model. And here inside, there is complete. This is defined as Boolean, and the same things happen here. So inside the toMap method, I'm going to say if this is complete, I have to pass 1. If this is true, I have to pass 1, otherwise 0. And here I also say that this is not a Boolean, in fact. And I'm going to say this is equal to 1. So if this is equal to 1, this is going to be true, otherwise this is going to be false. So let's hard restart again. So now that we hard restarted the application, we can see our task here. Right now this is not so beautiful, but we just mean to see that if we can add a task. But if you add your second task, come back and you see that nothing has happened. The task has been added, but this is not showing in the screen. So let's save the project and do also a hard restart. Now you can see that the second task has also been added. So what is the problem? The problem here is that you do not wait for the second task to be added. So inside the home screen, and inside the floating action button, when you navigate to the other page, you're now awaiting your navigation. So let's make this function async and also await. So now we are awaiting our navigation to other screen, and this code is not going to be finished until we get back from other screen. And when we get back from other screen, I'm going to call get all tasks. So the logic here is that when you navigate to other screen, this await is going to await for that, and this code is not going to be done as long as you are inside the other screen. So when the other screen is getting popped, this method is called, and this is getting all the tasks. So now let's come here, and let's add a third task, and add a task. And when you get out of the task, you see that the third task is also added. So this is pretty much everything about adding a task. Let's also take care of updating a task. So I'm going to go to navigate to a task screen every time I click on any of these tasks. So let's come back inside the task list style and wrap it with a gesture detector. And inside the onTap property, I'm going to define a function that is going to navigate to other screen. So now if we click on any of these items, this is going to take us to the second screen. But the problem here is that the title and description are not pre-populated. So now let's go inside the add task screen. And here I'm going to get a task as a property. And this also should be nullable, because when you normally press this button and come to this screen, you cannot pass a task because you're here to add a task. But if you click on any of these tasks and end up here, you need to pre-populate everything. So I'm going to make it nullable. And this should also not be required. But inside the init state, we have a condition. We say that if widget.task is not null, let's say this is widget. So if the widget.task is not null, it means if you're updating a task, if we come to this place from here, we have to populate our title controller and also description controller. So let's say this is equal to widget.task.title, and this is not null. And for the description controller, we also say widget.task.description, and the same is going to be for start date, and this is going to be widget.task.startDate. So let's hit save now. So now when you update the task, you have to pass your task here. And this is going to be our task. Nice. And if you now come back and click on the task pane, you see that the title and description and also the start date is pre-populated. But the problem here is that if I now click on the add task, this is going to add me a new task. For example, if I say this is going to be task 2 and say add task, you see that it has created a new task, but this is not what we want. So inside the add task screen, we need to create a new method. So I'm going to come back here and say future of type void, and I'm going to call it add update task, and I also want to make it async. So inside this method, I'm going to take care of a couple of properties. For example, one of the properties I'm going to take care of is going to be our form key. So if I'm going to be checking if our form is validated, and if and only if our form is validated, you have to save the form. So after saving the form, I'm going to also check if you're updating a task. And I'm going to do that by checking if our task is null or not. So if you're updating a task, let's call update task. And also await that. Otherwise, I'm just going to call add task. So we already have our add task method. Let's create our update task. For that, I'm going to go here where we define our add task. I'm just going to copy and paste it here one more time and call it update task. So this time, instead of using a task directly, I'm going to be saying we need to go inside widget.task and use the copy method. Let's also assume that this is not null, because when we call this method, we already have widget.task. So instead of using the task directly, I'm going to say widget.task.copy, meaning that I'm going to create a new instance of the task based on the original task. I'm going to pass my title, description, and also start date, but not my isCompleted. And here, instead of using a create task, I'm going to be using update task. So let's go back to our original method. Here I'm going to say, if you're updating a task, use update task, otherwise use an add task. And lastly, when you're out of this, we just need to navigate out of the screen. So for that, we need to use navigator of context.pop. And now let's copy this method, and inside this button, I'm going to be using it. So let's hit save. Now I'm going to go inside task pane, and I'm going to be updating it to task 2. And let's click on the add task button. And as you see, we got navigated out of the screen. But this task was not changed. And this is because we need to do a hard restart. So now as you see, the task is updated to task 2. But to let the list of tasks to be updated every time we update a task without doing a hard restart, we need to use our previous trick. So here inside the home screen, when we navigate to this screen, I'm going to say this method is async, and we await our navigator. And when we are just done with it, I'm going to say get all tasks, save. So if I now come here, and I'm going to change it to tea by milk, whatever. And I also notice that this is called add task. So let's go here and fix it. And instead of hard coding it to add task, I'm going to say if widget.task is not null, this is going to be update task. Otherwise, this is going to be add task. So if you hit save now, you see that this is update task. And if you click on the update, this is successfully updated to buy milk. So this was all about adding a task and also updating a task. Let's also take care of deleting a task. So here inside the delete button, all I have to do is to say, we first of all need to make the method async. And let's also await. Use the task database instance. And also we call delete task. And of course, we're going to be using widget.task.id. And we also make sure that this is not null. So now if we hit save and come back inside the task, for example this one, I'm going to say delete. And if you come back, you see that the task is deleted. So let's also use a navigator here. So every time we delete a task, we are also navigated back. So click on the task 2, press on the delete button, and this is deleted successfully. So now we can add a task, update a task, and also delete a task. Let's also make sure our task look like as we want. So I'm going to head back to the task list style. Here, instead of returning a simple title, I'm going to give it some style. I'm going to give it a font size of 20. I'm going to give it a font weight of bold. Let's make sure this is constant. And apart from the title, we also have a leading. So for the leading, I'm going to be using a checkbox. And in fact, I'm going to be using a Cupertino checkbox. So inside the value, I'm going to say task.isCompleted. And inside the unchanged, I'm going to put a method. So if we hit save now, you see that our task already look different. But inside the Cupertino checkbox, I'm going to provide a shape, and that's going to be a circle border. If we hit save now, you see that this is a circle, but this is a bit too small. So I'm going to go inside Cupertino checkbox, and I'm going to wrap it with a scale. I'm going to wrap it with a transform.scale. And inside the scale property, I'm going to say 1.5. So this is now going to look like 1.5 times bigger. Beautiful. So let's also make sure that this is going to be a stateful widget, because every time we click on any of this, we need to update our screen. So for that, inside the set, I'm going to define my isCompleted. I'm going to initially set it to false. And inside the init state, I'm going to say its value is equal to the widget.task.isCompleted. And here I'm going to be using isCompleted directly. But let's come inside the unchanged. And every time we press on that, I'm going to set state and change the isCompleted to the new value. And if the value is null by any chance, I'm going to set it to false. But after setting the isCompleted to the value, we also need to call the method. So let's say await, and I'm going to say tasks database. So let's make sure that this is async, first of all. And I'm gonna again call tasks database dot, and we need to import this one instance, and I'm gonna call mark task as completed. So for the ID, I'm gonna say widget.task.id, and for this completed, I'm just gonna say it's completed. But the problem is that I have to get it out of steady state, and now hit save. And if I now click on any of this item, you can change its completed state. And if you do a hard restart, you see that its completed state is persisting and it's not changing. So now that we have worked with the title, let's also make sure that we have a subtitle. And again, this is going to be a text. And this is going to be equal to widget.task.description. Let's hit save now. And you see that we already have a description. But I'm going to give you some style, like I'm going to provide a max length of 3. And I'm going to kind of give you the padding. So let's make sure to wrap it with a cart. And I'm going to give you a margin. And this is going to be agentsets.all 8. And it looks beautiful. But I also want to have a padding. So let's go and wrap our... Let's start with the padding. And the padding is also going to be 8. So it looks already better. But maybe we only need the padding to be on top and bottom. So I'm going to make it symmetric. And I'm going to say we only have it vertically and not horizontally. Looks better right now. But something that we miss here is the date. So if you go to the original design, and if you add a task, you see that we have a date here. So I also want to add that date. For that, I'm going to go inside the trailing. And here again, I'm going to add a task. And that's going to be widget.task.startDate. And also don't forget to format it. But if you hit save now, you see that this is a bit tangled with the description. So let's also make sure to wrap it with a padding. And now everything looks better. So this is pretty much everything about this app. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.